Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. In this video, we're going to explain how to use VBA to add data labels to points in scatter charts in Excel. We'll start by explaining why you might encounter a problem with adding data labels to scatter charts normally, and why the version of Excel you're using is important in determining whether you'll encounter this problem or not. We'll then show you how you can use a basic for each loop to add a label to each point in a series, before a couple of more complex examples including how to label multiple charts and how to label multiple data series in the same chart. In the final part of the video, we'll have a quick look at how to add labels to separate chart sheets, rather than the embedded chart objects we'll be working with for the most part of the video. So let's get started. If you're lucky enough to work in Excel 2013 or later, you won't actually have any trouble at all labelling the data points in a scatter chart with exactly the values you want. To do so, all I need to do is right-click on one of the data points and then choose to Add Data Labels and Add Data Labels again. And that will display the default data labels, which in this case are the values of the y-axis or the budget column in my small set of sample data. To change that, all I need to do is right-click on one of the data labels and choose to format them. Then, using the panel on the right-hand side, I can use this list of checkboxes to choose exactly which values to display. The really interesting option here is the one that says Value from Cells, and if I check that box, I get a basic range selector, which allows me to pick a block of cells from the underlying worksheet. So I'm going to click and drag to select my film names, and then click OK on the dialog box, and I'll see each data point gets the name of the film listed next to it. I can then uncheck the Y value box and get just the film names, and that labels my chart exactly the way that I want. Now sadly, that's not quite so easy to do in earlier versions of Excel. If I switch back into Excel 2010, it's certainly possible to add data labels to a scatter chart. That bit's not the problem. If I right-click on one of the data points and choose Add Data Labels, again, I'll get the default values of the y-axis. I can then right-click on the data labels and choose Format Data Labels. I'll get a list of checkboxes again, but obviously a much shorter list, so I can choose the Y value and the X value. I can also show the series name, which in this case is just the name of the column to which this data belongs. That's going to be the word budget. But sadly, I don't get the option to choose any cells. So if you're working in an earlier version of Excel, compared to 2013, then you don't have this easy, quick option to label the data points with values of cells, but it's still possible to achieve. And this video is going to show you how you can use some Excel VBA code to get that result. Now the basic process that we're going to use to achieve this is to loop through this range of cells containing the film names, and for each one of those cells we're going to associate the value in that cell with the correct data point. Now to make that work, we're going to take advantage of the fact that when you create an XY scatter chart in Excel, the data points are given an index number, and the index number is based on the position of the row of data in the list. So this first row of data generates a data point called data point 1, this is data point 2, data point 3, and so on. So if we can keep track of the number of films that we've processed, we'll be able to associate the correct name with the correct point. So to start writing this code, of course, we'll need to head into the Visual Basic editor. And as always, to do that, you can either head to the Developer tab in the ribbon and choose Visual Basic, or press Alt and F11 on the keyboard to launch the VB editor. Once you've done that, you'll need to insert a module in which to place your code. So let's right-click somewhere in the Project Explorer and choose Insert Module. I'm not going to bother renaming it this time, but if you wanted to, you could rename it down here in the Properties window. What I will do is create a quick subroutine, which I'm going to call Create Data Labels, and then hit Enter twice and Tab once. The core part of our approach to solving this problem is to use a for each loop. And if you've seen our video on for each loops in an earlier part of the series, you'll remember that you need to use at least one single variable to hold a reference to a single one of the objects of the type you're looping over. So we're going to declare a single variable called R as range. If you prefer, you can give it a more descriptive name, like maybe dim single cell as range, but I'm going to stick with R to make my code simple to write. There are a few other variables we're going to use as well, so we might as well declare them all at this point. The next one isn't absolutely necessary, but it will make our code a little easier to read. I'm going to say dim film names as range. What this one's going to do is hold the range of cells that we're actually going to loop over. The next variable is necessary. We need to keep track of the number of films that we've processed. So I'm going to declare dim film counter as integer. That'll be more than sufficient to hold the number of films we're about to loop over. And then one more that again isn't absolutely necessary, but will make some of the other parts of our code much easier to write. I'm going to say dim film series as series. So this is going to keep track or keep hold of a reference to the entire data series whose points we're going to be changing. The next job is to set what range of cells this film names variable will reference. So to make that work, I'm going to first of all make sure I go to the correct worksheet. I can't guarantee later on when I run the code that I'm already on sheet 1, so I'm going to make sure that I select that one first. I'm going to say sheet1.select. What I can then do is set film names equal to the range of cells that I'm interested in. In this case, if I switch back to Excel quickly, it's range A2 to A11. So the simplest way to achieve that back in the VB editor is to say set film names equals range A2 colon A11. Now the problem with doing it using that approach is that that's a very fixed static reference. If I added more films to my list or removed some films from my list, this would still look at ranges A2 to A11. So a much more dynamic, flexible way to achieve this is to say, rather than range A2 to A11, say range A2, followed by a comma, and then refer to the bottom cell in the list by using the end property. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is refer to the cell that is from the top of my list, from range A1, if I press the end key on the keyboard, and then the down arrow key, whatever cell I end up in. So essentially that stops just above the next blank cell in the list. So what I'm going to do is here, back in the VB editor, say range A2 to range A1, and dot end Excel down. If you've seen any of our previous videos on this technique, you'll be familiar with this by now. We've used it an awful lot throughout this series, so that makes a slightly more dynamic, flexible routine that will deal with any number of films, assuming that your list starts in cells A1 and A2. The next thing I need to do is set my film series variable to refer to the correct data series. So to make that work, I need another set statement. So I'll say set film series equal to, and now I need to reference the series that's in that chart object embedded on my worksheet. So I need to start with a reference to the worksheet that the chart belongs to. So the shortest way to do that is to use the code name of the sheet, which is called sheet 1 at this point. So if I say sheet1 dot. I then need to refer to the chart objects collection. So this refers to all of the chart objects embedded on that worksheet. And then in a set of parentheses, I need to reference the specific one that I'm interested in. Now I'm going to use an index number to do this, and because I only have one chart on the sheet, I know that its index must be the number 1. So I can say chart object 1 followed by another full stop. Now sadly at this point I lose the IntelliSense list, so I need to know something about the structure of chart objects. The next thing I need to refer to is something called the chart. So slightly confusingly, that refers to the chart that is in the chart object that's on the worksheet, and then finally I can refer to one of the series in that chart. So to do that, I can use this series collection, if you like, and again I'm going to use an index number to reference the correct data series, and in the chart that I've got here I only have one single data series, so I know that its index must be the number 1. So having written all of that out, I've now got a correct reference to the series of data whose points I want to access, and that makes a lot of the rest of the code we're about to write much simpler. Before we carry on with writing any more code, it's worthwhile quickly pointing out what you would need to do if you didn't use embedded chart objects, but rather separate chart sheets. So I'm going to switch quickly back to Excel, and I'm going to select that block of cells B1 to C11, and I'm going to choose to insert a new XY scatter chart. So I choose Insert, Scatter, and the basic XY scatter chart. That will sit as an embedded chart object again on the same worksheet. So what I'm going to do at this point is choose to move it, so using the Design tab in the ribbon, choose to move the chart to make it a new sheet called Chart 1. So should I want to loop over the data points in this chart, the way that I reference the data series is somewhat different. Back into the VB editor at this point, so Developer Visual Basic or Alt and F11, it's a much simpler, easier thing to do. So imagine that we didn't want to do this for our chart object. Should I want to reference the data series in chart 1, I can use its code name and then directly reference the series collection in there. So I could say set film series equals chart 1 dot series collection 1, and it would be as simple as that. So I'll leave that line of code in there for reference, just perhaps for later use. But what we're going to do in this example is stick with our chart object, the one that's embedded onto sheet 1. So just thought it was quickly worthwhile mentioning how you would access separate chart sheets rather than embedded charts like this one. Now before we can start changing the actual text on our data labels, we have to ensure that the data series actually has data labels. And we can do that by changing a single property of the series. So to make that work, we're going to say film series dot has data labels equals true. As simple as that. The advantage of our film series variable comes into play here. Without having our film series variable, we'd have had to say sheet1 chartobjects1.chart.series collection1 dot has data labels equals true. So this is a much more convenient way to reference that data series now. Now we can write out the basic structure of our for each loop. So as always, a for each loop begins with the words for each, and then we use the variable that holds a single range object, which is r in my case, in the range of cells that contains multiple cells. So in this case, that reference is held in the film names variable. So for each r in film names. I usually get into the habit of giving myself a couple of blank lines and then closing the loop, when in this case the statement will be next r, and then all the lines of code that we write in between these two lines will be executed for each individual cell in that block. So there are effectively just two lines of code that we need to write inside this loop. The first line is going to make sure that our counter is keeping track of the number of films we've processed so far, and then the second line will actually set the text of the data label with that same number to be the correct film name. So to increase the value of our film counter variable, when you declare an integer variable, it's initialized to a value of 0. And we need it to start at the number 1. So the simplest way to achieve that is inside our for each loop to increment the value of that film counter. So we can say film counter equals film counter plus 1. So the first time we encounter a film is going to set the value of that variable to 1, then the second film will be 2, and the third one will be 3, and so on and so on. The next step is to change the text of the data label to the corresponding data point. So again, we're going to use our film series variable to make our life a little easier. We'll say film series dot. Now a series in a chart has a points collection, which consists of the individual points in there. And if I open a set of parentheses, I can then pass in again the index number of the object that I'm interested in. So in this case, the index number is held in our film counter variable. So here, rather than explicitly hard-code a number, as I have done previously, with the numbers 1 here and here, I'm going to reference my film counter variable. I can then close the parentheses and then refer to the data label property of that point object. So I can say data label, and then another full stop, and finally the text property of that object. And I can finally make that equal to the value of the cell that is being referred to by my variable here called r. So I can say r.value. And essentially, that's all that we need to do. There's a very, very basic structure to loop through each individual cell and set the text of each data label. All that remains is now to execute the code to make sure that it does its job. So we can either do that from the VB editor if we click somewhere inside the subroutine and then either click the little green triangle, the run button, or press the F5 keyboard shortcut. Alternatively, we can head back to Excel and then display the list of macros here by clicking the macros button on the developer tab, or press Alt and F8, and then select the macro that we want to run and click the run button. And hopefully, having done that, we should see that each of the data labels, or each of the data points, gets a data label representing the film's name. Now that we've got the basic core of our code working, it's not too much effort to make it do even more work. On sheet 2 in the workbook, we've got a collection of multiple XY scatter charts. So each one's based on a different combination of columns being compared against each other. And what we really like to do is run the same code to label all the data points in all the charts on the sheet. So it's not too difficult to achieve actually, not a huge amount of extra code, just a slight reworking of what we've done so far. So back in the Visual Basic editor, what I'm going to do is copy and paste the entire subroutine that we've just written. So I'm going to copy it to the clipboard and then paste it in straight away down below. And I'm going to change its name so it's called sub create labels for multiple charts. Okay, and then all we've got to do is add a few extra lines to make this work for all the charts on sheet 2. Essentially, we're going to write a nested for each loop. So the for each loop that loops through all the individual cells to populate each data point is now also going to loop through each chart object in the chart object collection on the worksheet. So to make another for each loop, we'll need, of course, another object variable that can hold a reference to a single chart object each time we pass through the loop. So I'm going to call this one dimch as a chart object. What we then need to do is write a loop that says for each chart object in the chart object collection of the worksheet. So I'm going to add that line in just after I've set my reference to the film names variable. Oh, and before I do that as well, of course, I'm going to make sure that I go to sheet 2 this time rather than sheet 1. So the basic structure of the code is still, basic structure of the dataset still is A2 to A11, or whichever cell is at the end of the list from range A1. So once I've gone there and picked up my range of cells, I'm then going to say for each ch in sheet 2 dot chart objects. Okay, now that I've done that, the first thing that I want to be able to do is pick up a reference to the film series for that specific chart. So I'm going to tweak the line that I've got here so that it says set film series equals ch.chart.series collection 1. So rather than reference our specific chart object in the worksheet, it's going to reference whichever chart object is held in this variable. Okay, next I'm just going to delete the line that we commented out earlier on just to tidy things up a little bit. We've made sure that the film series has got data labels, that's correct. And then one more thing that we'll also need to do is make sure that each time we're looping through the data points in a new chart that we've reset our film counter variable. So one extra line of code just below here, we're going to say film counter equals 0. So that makes sure that it gets reset for each separate chart. I'm going to then select all the code down below here and then just indent it one space, either by clicking the indent button or pressing the tab key on the keyboard. We're incrementing our film counter as usual, then we're setting the appropriate data labels text to be the value of the cell that we're looping over, that's also fine. And then what we can also do is add a single extra next statement, so to make sure we close this loop for the charts, we're going to say next ch. Okay, so that's one way to make that system work. We're looping through each individual chart and then looping through each cell. We could have also made it work completely the opposite way around. We could have made it work so that we loop through all the cells, and then for each cell that we find, each film name, loop through the individual chart objects and change the data label. So it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference, whichever way you prefer to make the code work. This is the one that I'd like to go for. So just to test that this does actually work, we can head back into Excel. And then making sure we're on sheet 2 as we are, we can head to the macros tab and then choose create data labels for multiple charts and then choose to run it. And there we go, we should see all the charts data points get labelled with the correct film names. We can use a similar approach of nested for each loops to process multiple data series in the same chart. So if we head on to sheet 3 in the workbook, here we've got a scatter chart that first of all compares runtime against budget, and then compares runtime against box office. We're using two separate data series in the same chart. So to make this work, we're going to have another subroutine that's going to loop through all the data points on the chart, but it's going to do that for each individual data series as well. So back into the Visual Basic Editor, we're then going to create another new copy of the original routine that we wrote. So I'm going to go back to the top and then copy and paste this subroutine, and then paste it down at the bottom, and we'll call this one create data labels for multiple series. So of course there are a couple of things that we'll need to change about this subroutine to make it work. First of all, a quick simple thing to change. Make sure we're referencing sheet 3 rather than sheet 1, and we've referenced sheet 1 twice there, so let's change those references. Next, I'm going to just delete this commented outline again, we don't really need that. And then thinking about what we need to do in terms of enabling data labels, we now have multiple series which require their data labels to be enabled. So rather than using our film series variable to reference one specific series in the series collection, we're going to use this as a control variable in a for each loop. So rather than saying set film series equals, we're going to say for each film series in sheet3.chartObjects1.chart.series collection, but rather than referencing a specific individual series collection, which can refer to the entire collection of series objects. So for each one of those, we would like to enable the data labels, so we'll say film series.hasDataLabels equals true, and then following that we'll say next film series, and that little loop there will achieve the result of making sure that every series enables or has data labels enabled. We then need to do a similar thing when we change the text of each data label. So we don't want to do that just for one single film series, we want to make that work for multiple series. So the simplest thing to do here is to copy and paste the for each line. So I'm going to say for each film series in Sheet 3's series collection, and so on and so on. So I'll copy that, and then I paste that in just above where it says film series.points film counter. So I paste that in there. Then just below the line which changes the data label's text, I'm going to say next film series, and then just indent the film series, the line that changes the data label's text to make things look a little bit neater. So again, not too much here to change again, but it fundamentally changes what this set of code does. So having changed all the things we need to change, we ought to be able to head back into Excel now, and then again making sure we're on sheet 3 this time, head to the macros list, and this time run the code that's changing the data labels or creating data labels for multiple series. If I choose run, we should find that once again we get all the data points of the chart labelled with the correct film name. As one last example then, we're going to show you how you can make this whole thing work if you're using charts that are separate chart sheets rather than embedded chart objects. So to create a few more chart sheets fairly quickly and easily, I'm going to head back onto sheet 2, and then I'm going to select each of these charts and use the design tab in the ribbon to move them to be new sheets. So I'm going to create one called chart 2, and then back onto sheet 2 again and select the next one and move this chart and make it chart 3, and that'll be sufficient to demonstrate the principle. So we've got 3 separate charts: chart 1, chart 2 and chart 3. So back into the Visual Basic editor again, and in order to make this one work, the simplest thing to do is copy the second subroutine that we wrote, the one that's called Create Data Labels for Multiple Charts. So I'm going to copy that entire subroutine and then paste it down at the bottom, and we'll update its name so it says Create Data Labels for Multiple Chart Sheets. Now again, there's just a few changes to make to the code. First of all, the variable that we used before referred to a chart object class. This time we're going to be looking through a collection of charts, so that the object type or the class of object is a chart. So we say dim ch as chart. Next, it doesn't really matter which worksheet we select because the film names on each worksheet are all exactly the same and in the same cells. So here we're using sheet 2, but that's absolutely fine, that really doesn't matter. What we then need to do is make sure we update our loop to make sure we're not looping through each individual chart object in a specific worksheet. We're looping through each individual chart in the charts collection of the entire workbook. So we can simply say for each ch in charts. The last bit of code that we need to change is in the line which sets a reference to the film series. Rather than saying ch.chart.seriesCollection, now we need to say simply ch.seriesCollection, because the ch variable refers to a chart now rather than a chart object. Slightly confusing terminology, I know, but sadly that's the way that it works. Okay, so having done all that, what we should be able to do now is head back into Excel, and in order to demonstrate this one properly, let's see, so the chart 1 doesn't contain any data labels as it stands, chart 2 still does. So what I'm going to do is right click on the data labels and choose to format them. Then I'm going to click the Reset Label Text button, which should just clear them. And then likewise for chart 3, I'll do the same thing. Right click the data labels, choose Format Data Labels. I'll do that so you can actually see what I'm doing. Format Data Labels. And then Reset Label Text, and then close that window. I'm also going to uncheck the Y value box so I get rid of all the data labels entirely. Okay, so from doing that, what I should be able to do now is head back to the Macros button, and then choose the macro that says Create Data Labels for Multiple Chart Sheets, and choose to run it. And we've gone back to sheet 2 to pick up the list of cells, but if we go back to chart 1 and chart 2 and chart 3, we'll find that all the data labels reappear for all the film names. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the Wysl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.